Welcome to Direct Effect, Croatia's first EU law podcast. I'm your host, Martin Stier, and for today's episode, the very first episode, I have the privilege of talking to not only our professor of EU law, but also a renowned specialist in EU Migration and Asylum law, Professor Goldner Lang. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Martin.
Now, we thought about starting the podcast with maybe some more personal questions about your life, focusing more on your time as a student, but also later as an academic. And I think the ideal question to start this section would be, why did you enroll into law school?
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I have to congratulate you and your whole team for initiating this podcast on Direct Effect. I think it's a great idea, a great initiative, and I wish you all the luck. And I'm really, really happy and excited
Thank
to
you.
be the first one to actually participate in these types of conversations. So thanks. Now, responding to your question, why did I enroll in law? It was a kind of a combination of different circumstances that led to it. My passion was not so much in becoming an attorney, a solicitor, or a judge. I was always much more inclined towards international law issues, European law issues. I loved teaching. I loved researching, writing papers. That was what I loved from the very start. So I didn't see myself one day as, representing clients before the courts. And I also had a passion for languages. So I decided to study in parallel languages and law. So I first enrolled in the study program on English language and literature at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Zagreb. And then in parallel, I enrolled also in the law program that we also had at the University of Zagreb. And I graduated from both programs.
Did you find it difficult to study both?
Yeah.
Yes.
I did.
I can imagine,
I did.
yeah.
I did, but actually at the same time, I never regretted it. I think it was a good idea. It actually enabled me to get a wider perspective on different issues. It also helped me when I started actually emerging into EU law, because one of the things that we did in Zagreb at the very start, when I joined the law department and the EU law department, was actually having to create the terminology in EU law, which did not exist at that time. So having an understanding of how different languages work and not just using them as a tool, but actually thinking about them from the social perspective, linguistic perspective, did contribute, I think, to my work as a professor. Yes.
Okay. And so from the beginning, you knew that you wanted to, in a way, start and go into this academic career.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that Croatia, at the time that you were studying, wasn't an EU member state.
Exactly.
Now, what brought you to study or professionalize more into EU law?
Yeah. So once I graduated, I knew I wanted to get some experience in law practice. So I just started like most students do. I started working in a law firm. I wanted to pass a bar exam and actually see how these things work in practice. So I spent around 2 years or so working in a law firm in Zagreb. And this was really helpful to actually see, what things are actually like in Croatian courts. So, representing clients and so on. I passed the bar exam. This was one of the worst experiences of my life.
I can imagine.
I did pass it from the, at first, no problem, but still it was quite an exhausting experience. And then I immediately used the opportunity to go abroad and do my LLM, Master of Laws, in the UK. UK was at that time an EU member state. So I got a scholarship from the British government, and I went to London School of Economics. And at that time, one of the leading EU law professors was there, Trevor Hartley. who wrote one of the best ever textbooks on EU law. And I really, really benefited a lot from that experience. So I spent a year studying and specializing in different courses on EU law and some other courses as well at London School of Economics. I knew this was the direction that I wanted to take. And then when I came back, the moment I had a possibility, I applied to go and get a traineeship at the European Commission in Brussels. So I also wanted to see how things work from the other side. You know, at that time, Croatia was not yet an EU member state, neither was it at that time yet undergoing the accession negotiations.
Yeah, but could you, as someone who came from a non-member state, go and work into the Commission?
You could. It was much more competitive to actually get in. And I was lucky because I got to one of the DGs where I was dealing with legal issues. And at that time, the European Union was undergoing accession negotiations with Central and Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, and so on. And my supervisor, my boss at the Commission, told me at that time, listen, Iris, I know that you are from Croatia, and I know that it's just a matter of time when Croatia will have to undergo the same process. So probably it's not the wisest idea to actually include you in all this, but can you please keep to yourself all that you are going to see in these 5 months? And I said, yeah, okay. So she took me to all the meetings, working groups at the Council of Ministers, to all the meetings at the Commission. And I actually really got an insight at that time in terms of how it is to be on the other side of the table, representing the EU when negotiating accession of candidate countries, of future member states.
So you actually got to see both sides.
Yeah.
And then after that, how did your journey as an academic start?
Well, I one of the people who was the pioneers of EU law and my former boss was Siniša Rodin, who is now the Croatian judge at the Court of Justice of the European Union. So he was working already at that time at the Faculty of Law, University of Zagreb, and he invited me to join as a junior academic, so as an assistant PhD student. So I joined the law school. We established, and there were some other colleagues as well, we established the EU law department and started a number of courses. So at that time, there was no real course on EU law. So first, we started a course that was elective on European Union law, and later on it became compulsory. But it was a very gradual process.
Which is the European Public Law
today.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
I did not know this.
Yeah. So it was a process which was going in parallel with Croatian accession negotiations to the EU. And then I had an opportunity to actually see things from the candidate countries side in the accession negotiations, because I was taking part in 3 different accession negotiations working groups where I was among the colleagues who were representing Croatia now, sitting at the other side of the table with the Commission in Brussels and trying to actually argue certain facts that went in favor of Croatia in the process of implementing the whole EU law, acquis communautaire, into Croatian legal system.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like perfect timing in a way.
Yeah.
To be able to see one side and then be able to see the entire negotiations from the Croatian perspective,
Exactly.
and to be able to help Croatia enter the EU.
Yeah, we really felt that we were doing something new. We felt like pioneers. One of the people who was there was also a very dear colleague of mine, Tamara Čapeta, who is now the Croatian Advocate General at the Court of Justice of the European Union, and some other colleagues. And we had a feeling that we were creating something new, not only the terminology that I've already mentioned, because there was no Croatian word for advocate general, for example, or anything else. But also that we were actually educating new generations of people who are now just, judges,
Yeah.
solicitors, people working at really high level positions in Croatian public administration, in EU institutions, and they were taught by us about EU law and this interrelation between EU law and national law in Croatia.
Yeah. And where does, for example, the migration and asylum law come into play?
Okay, yeah. So, I had to choose what would be the topic of my PhD research.
Okay.
And one of the things that I really found extremely interesting was anything that had to do with the mobility of people, so free movement issues. And I was interested in how the EU internal market law functioned in terms of mobility of EU citizens. And this was something that I looked at in my PhD. But also, I wanted to compare this to the position of non-EU citizens, so third country nationals, and see what their position was in terms of, having access to the EU territory, either as economic migrants or as refugees and so on. So I loved, to look at this interface and see how these two different categories of individuals, EU citizens on the one hand and third country nationals on the other hand, had different rights.
Yeah.
And what was the legal basis for that and the political reasoning behind it.
And all of this, you were doing all of this before the 2015-2016 crisis, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Before the entire migration and asylum theme was in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I did. So again, I used the opportunity to go and write and do part of my research for my PhD abroad. I went and spent around 6 months or so, again in London, at the London School of Economics. And I wrote my PhD in English, so I wanted to publish it internationally. And already then, I was thinking with my colleagues at the EU Law Department, what different topics and courses we need to create to educate our students in the area of EU law, enable them to specialize in EU law. Because there was this compulsory course at that time, which is now called European Public Law, where you learn the basic facts about EU institutions, supremacy of EU law, Directive Act, the basics of EU internal market law, and so on. But we realized that we needed to establish a course on EU internal market law, so the fundamental freedoms. And I applied for the European Union funding and got a grant to establish a huge project on EU internal market law. So I established a Jean Monnet module on EU internal market law and started this course. And that was a huge novelty, again, the first course on EU internal market law in Croatia. And then I applied for the same funding and got a Jean Monnet module in EU Migration and Asylum law a couple of years later. And I applied and got a UNESCO Chair on free movement of people, migration, and intercultural dialogue. So all the things that I saw as important to establish in order to teach students about EU migration, asylum law, EU free movement law, and so on, I tried to kind of create in such a way that they were at the same time international projects that would enable us and other academics to research and to publish in these areas and to gain some knowledge and create new knowledge in these areas as well.
Yeah. And I think, well, we've talked about this before. To go on to today's theme, which will be, of course, the EU Migration and Asylum Pact. And I've already told you that I've been listening to different podcasts and reading different articles and everything. And most people that I've heard talk about this EU Migration Pact were pretty optimistic. On the other hand, I heard the podcast where you talked, and you didn't seem that optimistic about this, which is why I think it would be interesting to go and analyze a bit the Migration Pact, especially from the perspective of Croatia. So, in a few words, what is the Migration and Asylum Pact? And what will be the new changes that it brings?
Okay. So currently, the EU migration and asylum system are not really working perfectly. On the one hand, what we have based on the current EU legal framework in this area, we have EU member states having the authority and the power to regulate who is entitled to enter their respective territories for economic purposes, meaning third country nationals. So if you're a third country national, a non-EU citizen, and you want to come to the EU for purposes of work, basically it depends on that particular EU member state whether they will admit you to their territory and give you the right to reside there and the work permit. So the system in that respect, when it comes to economic migration, is very fragmented. On the other hand, when it comes to rules on refugees, so on people who are running away from different types of disasters around the world and who want to seek protection in the European Union, there is an EU law framework. So there are common EU law rules on who is entitled to get such protection in the EU, on what basis, what conditions that person must fulfill, and what procedures that individual needs to undergo. So basically, the idea is that no matter whether you have a refugee who is running away from, for example, Ukraine or Syria or anywhere in the world, and wants to seek protection in Croatia, in Germany, in Hungary, or in Sweden, that person needs to fulfill the same conditions to be granted asylum, and that the procedure and the protection he or she will get will be the same no matter where the procedure is taking place. That's what the law says. In practice, we have huge differences, huge discrepancies among EU member states because things are not working perfectly for different reasons. One of the reasons is that EU member states which are creating the EU external borders towards third countries, which includes also Croatia, are exposed to huge pressures as most asylum seekers, most refugees get to their external borders first. So these states are in most cases responsible for examining these asylum applications based on the so-called state of first entry rule, the Dublin regulation. And they perceive it as kind of unfair. They're saying, well, there needs to be a kind of solidarity among member states. They need to be able to share the responsibilities and burdens equally. On the other hand, these states, due to the fact that they are exposed to huge numbers of people trying to enter the EU, in most cases, in quite frequent cases, are not capable of processing so many asylum applications in an efficient and human rights compliant manner. So there are human rights issues involved here as well. There are quite a lot of allegations of pushbacks happening at EU external borders. And there is this question, the big kind of question that has not been really responded well, what the EU actually wants to do. To what degree it's ready to open its borders towards these people, like it has opened its borders for Ukrainian refugees, and to what degree it is going to say no
Yeah.
we are going to accept only a limited number of such people because we can simply not function in such a way to be exposed to millions of people arriving in a short time span.
Yeah.
So there are huge political, social, and legal and economic implications of this. And the European Union simply is not unanimous in what the right response should be. And the Migration Pact is a kind of a proposal which has been set on the table by the European Commission, which consists of a number of different legislative proposals, mostly regulations, EU regulations, where the EU asylum system is trying to be amended, reformed, hopefully for the better.
Yeah.
And now the question is, coming back, to your initial comment, is depending on whom you ask, people will give different responses whether this type of reform that is currently undergoing negotiations in EU institutions is or is not the right response to all these challenges.
Yeah. And from Croatia's perspective?
From Croatia's perspective, it's going to, if adopted, one of the regulations which is contained within this set of proposals will establish something that will be called border procedures, which will be novel type of procedures happening at the EU's external borders towards third countries, meaning also Croatia, where you will have thousands and thousands of those who arrive who will not be allowed to enter deeper into the EU territory, like they currently do, in order to have their asylum applications examined. So they will be kept at the border, and their asylum applications will be actually examined there, meaning that you will have even more so-called hotspots, like the ones that you currently have in Greece and in certain parts of Italy as well, that you will have them along the EU's external borders, meaning that EU's member states like Croatia, which are at the external borders, will have even more pressure, I would say. But this pressure will not be visible when you go further into Croatian territory. This will all be happening at the Croatian borders towards Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, meaning that, it will create huge human, financial, and other pressures on the Croatian system.
But isn't in a way, for example, contrary to the principle of solidarity, especially taking into consideration that these states that are at the border of the EU will have to burden all these, well, first of all, the people, then the finances, then I suppose the police also, food, shelter.
That's true. I mean, it's partly the answer is yes, because, and this is one of the main arguments coming from the Mediterranean countries, like, for example, Italy and Greece, which are saying this is not fair. This is putting even more pressure on us. And the idea of the reform was to ease the pressure away from us. So it's partly true. On the other hand, other states, which are maybe more in the western and northern part of Europe, are saying, well, no, we will be actually contributing to you in different ways. So there are three types of solidarity contributions which will be possible. Either other states will be obliged to relocate a certain number of people who are arriving to the EU territory and actually saying, okay, we are taking them and moving them to our territories to actually examine their asylum applications there. So that will be one possibility to show solidarity, relocation from states like Croatia, like Greece, like Italy. The other possibility will be to say, no, we are not actually taking that many people as we are supposed to, but we will instead give our money into the EU budget.
Okay.
And each person that is not being relocated currently, it is being negotiated, will be worth 20,000 euros. So, you actually have to give the amount of money,
Yeah.
which is, how much is an individual worth.
Yeah.
And then the third possibility would be to say, okay, we are investing again our money in the operational system of states like Croatia, Italy, and Greece by helping them actually have these facilities at the borders function better. And also we have to take into consideration another argument that is being used by Western and Northern European states. They're saying, well, yeah, it's true that maybe the highest number of individuals will be located in states which are the states creating the EU's external borders.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the money that they will get to actually be able to run these facilities is coming mostly from the EU budget.
Yeah.
So there are actually two sides, of the same coin. Depends whom you ask.
Yeah.
But what the main argument is, coming from states like Italy, for example, is that giving money is not enough, because you end up with a huge number of individuals who are at your territory, and they are not scattered around the territory equally, but they are all at the borders, which can have, huge negative consequences. And put a lot of burden in terms of whether this state is actually capable in examining these asylum applications in an efficient and human rights compliant manner.
And the proposition of, for example, the quota system, that was, well, there are certain things that, for example, a lot of people do see the situation with Ukraine, for example, with Ukrainian refugees were in a way scattered throughout the entire EU, while, for example, migrants that come from the Middle East or from Africa are usually concentrated in some states.
Yeah.
And there was this proposition, and I suppose there still is this proposition, especially coming from some member states, to introduce a quota system.
Yeah. This is something that was the proposition put by the Mediterranean countries, and that was not accepted as a kind of compulsory solidarity system, at least in the current state of negotiations. Why? Because certain states are saying, no, we're not willing to accept quotas in terms of, okay, we have to relocate a certain number of individuals no matter what.
Yeah.
They want to have this alternative to that, giving money or helping in other ways. And, the question is whether the quota system really is the solution.
Yeah.
The Ukrainian refugees were not really a problem because here, this is, I would say, the unique example when the European states, including all its EU member states, really showed solidarity towards Ukrainian refugees on the one hand and among themselves on the other hand. But the legal basis for the stay of Ukrainian refugees on the EU territory are not these regulations and currently directives that I've been mentioning, but it's another piece of EU legislation. It's the so-called Temporary Protection Directive, which has so far been used only once with regard to Ukrainian refugees. So, some people are saying that there is a lot of hypocrisy because Europe is showing a lot of readiness to open its doors towards Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah.
And most states, including Croatia, have done an excellent job in really providing shelter to these people in a timely manner, ensuring that they will have their residence here, that they will have food, access to education, access to work, and so on. But then on the other hand, other people who are coming from other parts of the world who are not that maybe similar
Mm-hmm.
in terms of their language, the way they look, their culture, maybe their religion, and so on. They are They are treated differently.
Yeah.
Europe is not really willing to open the doors to them.
And in regards to this regulation based on which Ukrainian refugees had the opportunity to enter the EU, there was no compulsory solidarity, or was there?
No. So the Temporary Protection Directive functions only provided there is an agreement to actually trigger the application of that directive
Okay.
in the Council of Ministers.
Mhm.
And the agreement was reached. So there was a political will to do it on the side of all 27 EU member states.
Okay.
And there is currently no agreement in terms of how many Ukrainian refugees each EU member state will or has the capacity to allow to enter their territories. But so far, there haven't been any problems.
Mm-hmm.
So not a single EU member state has yet said, okay, we have had enough.
Yeah, yeah. Now, does this not having a compulsory solidarity system in a way give the liberty to certain states or most states to in a way discriminate against some migrants and against some migrants, well, not?
Yeah. So you're right. So, on the one hand, if you look at EU law, no discrimination in this respect would be allowed. Because if you are a refugee who is coming from no matter which part of the world, and you reach the EU territory and apply for asylum, there are no quotas applicable to you. So your asylum application has to be assessed based on EU law standards and international law standards. And if you fulfill the conditions based on the EU law and the Geneva Convention to be granted asylum, you should be granted asylum. However, in practice, first of all, for most of these nationals, it's extremely difficult to actually reach the EU territory because, how do they get to the EU territory in the first place? They will be stopped on the way in most cases. And second, will they really have the opportunity to apply for asylum? And how long will they have to wait to actually be granted asylum? With Ukrainian refugees, this is not happening. When they get to Europe, they are not actually applying for asylum. The Temporary Protection Directive enables that they are all admitted to the EU territory in a speedy manner, and that their applications are not assessed on a case-by-case basis. So they are given temporary protection. In the meantime, if they want, they can apply for asylum, but they don't have to. And the temporary protection grants them basically equal rights as if they had been granted asylum, but for a limited time period. That's why it's only temporary.
Okay. Now we can go from here to another thing that you've been critical, which are these agreements struck by the EU with other third countries, such as, for example, in a few months ago with Tunisia, but also I think Turkey, Morocco, which are, well, so-called these cash for migrant control agreements.
Yeah.
Now, what is the idea behind these agreements and why are you so critical about them?
Yeah. So, these agreements should be viewed in within the framework of something that is in EU Migration and Asylum law called externalization of EU migration and asylum policy. What does it mean? So, as the word suggests, what the EU is trying to do is to use different methods how to externalize its own policy by saying we are kind of transferring the responsibility and the job on somebody else, into somebody else's hands. And one of the methods that is currently really, I would say, very, very becoming more and more dominant day by day as you rightly stated, is to enter into agreements with third countries where the EU is giving them a lot of money and saying, okay, we would appreciate if basically you would keep those migrants and prevent them from actually accessing, from getting to the EU territory. No matter whether we are talking about states like Libya, for example. So basically, they're stopping the migrants from crossing the Mediterranean Sea and getting, in most cases, to Italy. Or whether we are talking about the deal with Turkey, where the EU member states entered into this agreement with Turkey and gave them a lot of money to prevent people from actually getting to the Greek border, or actually using other ways to keep people at the border and prevent them from entering the European Union territory. Now, why am I being critical towards this? Because, you know, there is again a problem of hypocrisy. You know, on the one hand, the EU is saying we are really very much insisting on the protection of fundamental rights, human rights of these people. We have our laws, which are really set on high standards. We respect international law obligations and insist on respect of individuals' rights based on the EU Charter, the European Convention, and so on. On the other hand, the EU is actually giving money to somebody else to do the dirty work. Yeah. And the way some of these agreements work is that basically the money is given through systems which are outside the EU Migration and Asylum law framework. So the money is given also as part of the so-called development aid to certain third countries. And if you look at EU law, so EU primary law, the treaty, development aid is a type of assistance that is given to third countries to fight poverty. And currently, in the current EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework, which is adopted from 21 to 2027, it is stated that 10% of this money, which is given as development aid, should be earmarked for migration purposes. So the question is whether basically the EU is using the money which is intended to fight poverty for a very different purpose, to prevent migrants from getting to the EU territory.
Yeah. And do these agreements work? Are there any statistics?
Well, if you look at, for example, Turkey, according to some statistics and some official statistics, there are currently on the EU territory around 3 million Syrian nationals who have been stopped in Turkey and who all want to go to the EU. According to some unofficial numbers, there are even more. There are 4 million of Syrian nationals on the Turkish territory. So I would say that, you know, they work from that perspective. The problem is, you know, what is happening to these people there. They're kind of stuck. They cannot go forth and they cannot go back. And they're living for years in really bad conditions in those reception centers, in camps. And the question is whether this is really the intention. And then what is happening is that some of these third countries are actually exploiting this by using these human beings as objects to force the EU to give them even more money. And this has taken place, for example, on the Greek-Turkish border several years ago, when Turkey actually put several thousand of these people on buses, drove them to the Greek border, and let them out, and told them the border is now open. You can go in. They will let you in. So they lied to them. And then there was it was quite dangerous, because on the other side of the fence, on the other side of the border, there were police officers and the army, and even the president of the European Commission flew urgently to Greece to give support to Greece, and thanked Greece for acting as the shield of the European Union. So, this is something that is happening also at the border between Belarus
Yeah.
and some EU member states, where these third countries are instrumentalizing, are using these human beings and treating them as objects
Yeah.
for their individual purposes, political, financial, and so
Yeah.
on.
Is there any proposition on how to eliminate this threat of other countries using migrants and people as a geopolitical tool? For example, I'm not sure if there's a proposition in the new Migration and Asylum Pact, or rather, if the idea of the EU is to use these bilateral agreements as a way to resolve this.
So the idea is to combine
Yeah.
different methods to go into even more bilateral agreements, definitely, or multilateral agreements. That's something that the EU has stated as one of its priorities. So we can expect more and more of such agreements with third countries. And on top of that, in the Migration Pact, so in the current proposal for the reform of the EU asylum system, there is a piece of EU legislation, another regulation on force majeure, and so crisis and force majeure proposal, where it is intended to enable EU member states that in case of instrumentalization of migrants from a third country, they can actually rely on methods which are not necessarily in accordance with other EU asylum rules. And this is something that is also being proposed in the current amendment of the Schengen Borders Code, where for the first time, the EU is proposing to define the word instrumentalization, basically suggesting that this is what has been happening at the Belarus EU border, on the side, of course, from the Belarus, and where it's proposing to enable EU member states that in case of instrumentalization, they can make it even more difficult for these people who are being instrumentalized to get to the EU territory, meaning that they can limit the number of border crossing points and close some border crossing points completely, that they can limit the number of working hours of some of their border crossing points, that they can also speed up the procedures and not apply asylum rules the way they're supposed to be applied, meaning basically to make it easier for these states to push back those third country nationals.
Okay. I think our time is up in a way. So I would first like to thank you for coming. Before we end, we thought about asking you a question. Of course, this is a student-led podcast. So if you have any suggestions, any advice for fellow students.
Okay. So a general advice to students that I always try to kind of transmit to any students that ask me this question is really to use all the opportunities that you have currently. And you do have them in Croatia, no matter, what the current situation might be in the world. So really to use, no matter whether you want to become an attorney, judge, a researcher one day or so on, to use all international possibilities that there are. I've taught European Union law and EU Migration and Asylum law around the world. I've been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. So I've been a visiting professor at University College London, at a number of places around the world. I've just this summer I taught some lectures in Tokyo. So I can really compare our students to students worldwide. And I can tell you that our students are just as good and as great, I would say, as students everywhere else or anywhere else. And that you shouldn't be intimidated and always try to achieve the best. Just, use all the possibilities that you have. Go on Erasmus, go and specialize in certain areas. Whether you want later on to do an LLM, yes, you can do it in Croatia, you can do it abroad. And always try to learn and find things that you feel passionate about.
Okay.
So the most important way to be successful in your career, no matter what you do, is that you find something that you are passionate about. And that will ensure that you will be successful in that.
Professor Goldner Lang, it's been an honor talking to you. Thank you for coming for the podcast.
Thank you.
It's a wrap.
Thank you.